In July 2013, a raging controversy broke over whether Hollywood had collaborated with Nazis right before World War II. Two books had come out that year, Hollywood and Hitler by film historian Thomas Dougherty, which offered the more balanced view, arguing that the industry's behind-the-scenes dealings were more apt to tarnish than polish the luster of the Golden Age mythos. At the same time, Dougherty contended the industry was no worse than the rest of American culture in its failure of nerve and imagination, and often a good deal better in the exercise of both. Ben Irwin's The Collaboration, in contrast, went way over the top, insisting that before 1939, Hollywood had actively collaborated with Nazi Germany. Perhaps sensing an opportunity, Harvard University Press, which published The Collaboration, hired a public relations firm. The firm then went on to attack Dougherty, a film historian, in the pages of the New York Times. And for those of you who might not sort of catch the reference there, it's kind of mind-blowing that one academic would, in a sense, go after another academic and public in that fashion. My purpose here is not to rehash a debate in which one side offered an ultimately silly and nonsensical polarity. Hollywood decidedly did not collaborate with Nazi Germany, though not being able to anticipate an even more catastrophic failure, did try to keep its business interests in play throughout Europe for as long as possible before the outbreak of World War II. And Nazi Germany most certainly would have liked to see itself bending so-called Jewish Hollywood to its will. Irwin likely did not have to look hard in the German archives for evidence of that. Rather, my purpose is to suggest that even something as arcane as debate over what Hollywood ought to have done some 70-odd years ago can tell us a lot about what people are grappling with today. As the comments section of the Chronicle for Higher Education story profiling that particular controversy played out, Hollywood and Hitler had become a litmus test for how readers viewed homegrown American hate groups and their alleged ties to the Tea Party right. My purpose, furthermore, suggests that when people sometimes get trapped in silly and fruitless debates, they often overlook opportunities at the expense of confronting substantive but nettlesome questions. Those questions raise serious ethical quandaries operating in the parallels between the historical and the present, but persist despite or because of their lack of easy answers or solutions. The question of media responsibility amid a refugee crisis is one such issue that demands attention. Most discussions about the media and refugees fall into a few categories. The most straightforward topic addresses how news media did or did not cover a refugee crisis. A 1997 report on the Rwandan genocide from the Carnegie Corporation sums up much of this literature. The news media excel at calling initial attention to a crisis, but as coverage continues, the reporting distorts what is taking place and even contributes to the international community's failure to be active in effectively preventing further genocides. It's like the old Seinfeld episode where Jerry points out that the car rental company is good at taking the reservation, they're just not good at keeping it. Another major discussion category involving refugees and media focuses not so much on the depiction of refugees, but on Jewish and anti-Nazi refugees behind the camera. Working in the European film industry throughout the 1920s and 30s, these people fled Germany and elsewhere before finding haven and employment in Hollywood in that period, the 1930s, 1940s. This conversation less directly engages how Hollywood depicted refugees. Instead, it emphasizes how talented refugee filmmakers could synthesize their distinctly European sensibilities with decidedly more lowbrow popular entertainment, including genres such as horror and film noir. Much of this history invites potential allegorical or elusive readings of these films, building upon the idea that a director can use popular entertainment to reflect personal biography. For example, many have argued that the dark and fatalistic sensibility of film noir, encompassing many titles directed by European émigrés, reflected a post-war cynicism brought on by full revelations of wartime horrors and atrocities. Similarly, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, nominally a horror film from 1939, invited modern-day parallels to the plight of gypsies in Victor Hugo's novel. William Dieterle, a German émigré who was neither Jewish nor a refugee, directed a film that operated simultaneously as horror and, through surrogate gypsies, as commentary on the plight of 1930s German Jewish refugees. Neither of these discussions get at what I believe to be the more challenging ethical question, namely, what should the role of popular culture be in calling attention to the plight of refugees? And what are the ethical dimensions of depictions that do occur? In 2015, the photograph of a drowned 3-year-old Syrian boy, Aylan Kurdi, having washed up on a Turkish beach, provoked international outrage. Some argued the brutality of the image was justified in spurring not just outrage, but international action. Others complained that the image was horribly exploitative, what one observer deemed a snuff photo for progressives, dead child porn, that ultimately substituted a self-satisfied feeling of sadness for serious debate on the crisis. Again, my purpose is not to definitively resolve these sorts of debates, but to point out that ethical positions also have ethical pitfalls, especially when the ethics involve subjects who already have experienced a great degree of victimization, without having to add the insult to misrepresentation to injury. Fictionalized representations of suffering add yet another layer of complexity to the mix. Regarding Holocaust films, Elie Wiesel once complained of how they trivialize what should be left unrepresentable. How can one produce the machine-gunned, the gassed, the mutilated corpses, Wiesel asked, when the viewer knows that they are all actors and that after the filming they will return to the hotel for a well-deserved bath and meal? A frequent criticism of Hollywood is that it did not do more to address the plight of Jewish refugees during World War II. But there were many who saw such depictions as horribly tasteless and exploitative for reasons like the ones Wiesel identified. The gloss and glamour of 1940s Hollywood was ill-suited to the gritty realities of human suffering, and any attempt to depict the plight of refugees would risk appearing horribly insincere and hopelessly fake. In addition to overlooking unanticipated consequences of what might have occurred had Hollywood done more to represent refugees, this criticism overlooks the many ways in which Hollywood films did in fact represent the refugee crisis at the time. Much of the historiography of this criticism is short-sighted, forgetting that going to the movies back in the 1940s meant seeing a full program, inclusive not just of the feature, but also of short subjects. One finds plenty of references to the plight of refugees, both in feature films that, for whatever reason, are no longer available on DVD, but also in a variety of lesser-known and ephemeral titles. The 1943 MGM short You, John Jones illustrates how these representations depicted the refugee crisis, not as a particularity for any one group, but as a universality of suffering for all peoples. In this film, star James Cagney plays an air raid warden who imagines what life for his daughter would be like in a variety of war-torn situations. Child star Margaret O'Brien, Hollywood's go-to moppet of choice for such roles, set the narrative into motion as she rehearses a recitation of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address for a school presentation. Called suddenly to his watch station on a moonlit night, Cagney's John Jones imagines how war would terrorize his daughter if she existed in various countries throughout a world where the principles of human equality as outlined in Lincoln's speech no longer apply. And so I wanted to just show you a little clip of the part where he imagines what would happen to his daughter in these various situations.
I wonder, John Jones, if you do appreciate. Suppose you and your home and your wife and your child, your baby, John Jones, your baby, were a part of one of those other places. In England, for instance, John Jones. In England. Your baby, John Jones, your baby. In Greece. Your baby, John Jones, your baby. China. Your baby, your baby. Yugoslavia. Your baby. France, fighting France. Your baby. Australasia. Your baby. Czechoslovakia. Your baby. Russia.
So I think while one can easily criticize these representations as relying upon substitution of an appealing white child star to garner empathy for the actual Chinese war orphan, one must place this universalism within the context of the times. The film's representation cued to the wartime message of the Roosevelt administration. Rather than single out the plight of any one persecuted group, the message sought to universalize the suffering of all groups because of the war and because of things like Nazi aggression. Rather than commit to specific actions that would result in the rescue of European Jews, the Roosevelt administration adopted the winning of the war as the primary strategy that then would have the net benefit of saving what remained of European Jewry, along with the suffering of other peoples. One should recall the massive opposition that existed in the U.S. to admitting refugees during this period, even refugee children. A 1939 Gallup poll conducted in March of that year suggested that 2/3 of the country specifically opposed admitting refugee children. And think about that for a moment. 2/3 of this country refused to allow refugee children, many of whom were Jewish, from entering into this country, just the children. The Wagner-Rogers bill, which would have admitted between 10,000 to 30,000 refugee children to the U.S., met with stiff opposition from patriotic groups like the American Legion and the Daughters of the American Revolution. According to Richard Brightman and Alan Lichtman, individuals and organizations barraged Congress and the Roosevelt administration with telegrams and letters of protest. Republican William J. Castle, a former Undersecretary of State, lobbied one of the bill's sponsors, arguing, and this is a quote, "I should prefer to let in 20,000 old Jews who would not multiply." Hollywood itself was a target of much of this anti-refugee sentiment. And I think I can kind of say with some degree of certainty that refugee was often a substitute for Jew. But refugee was the sort of more polite, more socially acceptable way of expressing that kind of prejudice. Syndicated gossip columnist Hedda Hopper frequently complained of the industry's preferential treatment of refugees. To shove our own people out of parts, extra, and bit work to make room for Europe's refugees is attempting to right one justice with a much greater one, she wrote in October of 1941. We wouldn't think much of a mother who shoved out into the cold and starved her own children so that she could take in and feed the neighbors. But that's what's been happening on a big scale out here, despite the thousands of dollars collected over and over again from people for the benefit of those very refugees' home countries. I'm sorry, again, from film people for the benefit of those very refugees' home countries. I think it's interesting the choice of analogies that people use in these debates. And one thing that I've heard quite recently, which we can talk about this some more during the Q&A, is this idea that we need to lock our doors to stay safe at night. So it's interesting to me that these are not sort of new, or they might be sort of slight variations on earlier analogies, and I think they need to be called out. They need to be questioned, and the logic needs to be kind of confronted in the open air. In their 2013 book, FDR and the Jews, Brightman and Lichtman usefully reminded us that such prevalent beliefs, as ones like Hopper, ones described by Hopper, bureaucracy, infighting, and government inertia all constrained how much Roosevelt and his administration could accomplish in the rescue of European Jews. Writing in response to the argument that Roosevelt himself had abandoned European Jewry, it's an argument that's been brought up many times over the past few decades, the authors concluded that FDR was neither a hero nor a bystander to the Nazis' persecution and then annihilation of Jews. Rather than flatten a complex presidency, they argue that while his compromises might have seemed flawed in the light of what later generations have learned, we should remember that the depth and significance of the Holocaust, much less even the usage of the term itself, had not come into widespread consciousness until many years after Roosevelt's death. One can and should approach what 1930s and 40s Hollywood should have done about the plight of refugees. A mature and complex industry with many moving parts and managerial levels, the film industry then invites a certain historical amnesia for today. It is easy for us to sit in judgment of an admittedly flawed industry, but it's also easy to flatten out the complexities, obstacles, and constraints that those working within the industry faced. Such convenient forgetting ultimately results in the perpetual rediscovery of racist and xenophobic currents still operating within American society and outside of entities like the film industry, so that we conveniently remember about. What we conveniently remember about this history is the part where we played liberators, rather than the parts where some vociferously played isolationists and protectionists. The question remains: what do we expect of our media industries today, considering widespread human suffering and the reemergence of racist and xenophobic thought now ensconced in the highest levels of U.S. governance? As much as I would like to do otherwise, I cannot provide a definitive answer to this question. However, I think we can say we know from history that whatever representations of refugees do occur in the media, they do not occur in isolation. Instead, they reflect larger social, political, and cultural forces at work that ultimately will determine the fate of some of the most vulnerable and threatened populations in the world. So that's kind of where this ended up, and I thought we could spend the rest of the time sort of talking more about, I'm happy to entertain any questions or comments about the paper, but I'm particularly interested in talking more about the sort of the expectations that we have of media coverage of refugees today in this particular climate. So I'll just kind of throw things open there.
I've got a couple of questions, not about the current refugee thing, just background on the films. Who supported the making of that short is one, and I forgot my other one, but Peter.
So the short was actually released by MGM, which was one of the major Hollywood studios of that time. And it was done in 1943, so it was the height of the war effort. And so the industry, in order to help support the war effort, created this organization called the War Activities Committee, which was it was an industry group, but it was formed to help promote the wartime efforts of the Roosevelt administration. And what that group did was they helped produce some of these patriotic shorts and get them released into the theaters.
Interesting. As we were talking earlier, I have a colleague who has done research on the Why We Fight series, which was explicitly supported by the U.S. government. And Frank Capra was made an officer and served General Marshall.
Right.
And it's just a fascinating history to that. And one of the points that my colleague has made is the government censors had very strict rules about not denigrating ethnic groups and things like that, and that some of these outside groups were not so constrained, and so some of the more racist or ethnically insensitive portrayals were actually outside of government. It's just a fascinating thing I didn't know about.
Yeah, no, there was something called the production code, which was a list of do's, don'ts, and be carefuls, and sort of some of the rules seem kind of silly today. Like if you had a man and a woman sitting on a bed, like one foot had to be on the floor at all time. But other rules, I think, sort of more serious or reflected, I guess, maybe a more serious representation of American values at the time. For example, you couldn't show an interracial relationship in a film. And the part that you're referring to is also kind of interesting. So, yeah, you couldn't denigrate a member of another nation or ethnic group or religious group. But what's interesting was that rule. They weren't hard and fast rules. They're more like sort of good suggested practices. But that rule ended up kind of limiting what Hollywood could show in the films, because the argument was that if you depicted what was happening in Germany at the time, that might be a denigration of German citizens, and so these kinds of external factors were helping to sort of influence and shape the representations that actually did come out of Hollywood. The other thing I just mentioned real quick is the Why We Fight series is kind of an interesting series, because those films, and I forget how many there were. There were 7 altogether. Those films were actually not intended for American audiences. Those films were intended as orientation for the troops who were fighting overseas, and so and I think the other part of that intent was to try to convince these sort of young men who were about to go overseas and fight this war where sort of wasn't clear why the U.S. was fighting in Europe in particular, was to kind of convince them of the value of of performing that fight. And this had happened after this, say I think less than a year even, this extremely intense and divisive debate that took place in this country over whether or not the U.S. should in fact enter the war or not. And so those films were seen as a way to kind of make the best case, the best argument to mostly servicemen, about why they should be participating in that fight. Yes.
I recently had my students in my women's studies class take a short creative work and write an analysis of it. And so a lot of them actually chose commercials from the Super Bowl. And I didn't watch the commercials of the Super Bowl, but apparently, according to them, and according to some things I've read, there were a lot of commercials that were about refugees, and kind of from a humanitarian perspective, like these poor people, we have to let them in, and very little for the product itself. And then actually this morning I was just hearing on NPR a discussion about how a lot of the business community is concerned about the immigration restrictions because of the impact it will have on the economic environment. So there's this tension between, you know, these companies are trying to maybe construct themselves as very humanitarian, and yet maybe they're operating from this other concern about the impact on free trade. And I wonder if there's other tensions like that going on in that era that you're talking about.
I don't know of any off the top of my head in terms of the economic benefits. Certainly not on the scale that I think we see now. I mean, because and again, I'm not an expert in immigration or even sort of refugees, but it seems like, at least with the immigrants, that there are plenty of jobs out there that employers are having a hard time filling because, you know, like very few other people want those jobs or willing to take them. But I think that in terms of, you know, historical parallels, I think what we do see are parallels to the arguments as to why we shouldn't let in immigrants or refugees, even at that time. So I sort of, you know, read a little bit of the Hedda Hopper, you know, column where she was sort of like, there are good Americans who aren't getting, bit parts in Hollywood movies. But I think also during that time you saw a lot of sort of America for the Americans, that we have our own problems here, we have widespread unemployment, poverty, hunger. You know, why should we be letting more people in that are going to sort of be able to compete for scarce resources? And I think that argument deserves some kind of confrontation. Like, I'm not convinced that simply letting more people into the country is going to mean that there's more people competing for those resources. Because I think there's a lot of other sort of complicating factors that happen when you have lots of people, you know, for example, doing jobs that no one else wants. I think the situation itself was probably very different in terms of the sort of, say, for example, the interest of employers in getting cheap labor. I don't see necessarily a parallel there, but I do see a parallel in terms of the public response, and particularly opposition to admitting more refugees and immigrants. And again, it's not to say that I think we should be critical about what the motives of these companies are. Like, I think we don't want to be blind to the fact that a lot of these companies are interested in getting cheap labor. At the same time, I think it may be the motives of getting cheap labor that happen to be at any given moment the most humanitarian response. These people who have no other choice and are probably the most vulnerable populations in the world.
In terms of informational news, there's obviously been quite the increase in terms of covering up information to the public, or just not saying anything, or not providing proof, or my favorite new word, alternative facts. That in terms of news-based media, and then of course whatever comes out in terms of entertainment, whatever side they may take, they're going to present a viewpoint that is going to be biased in some way. And there are people who support that naturally, and there are others who absolutely despise that, feeling that political views should not be present in entertainment media. Like,
Right.
I don't believe that personally, but
Right. Well, I mean, it's a very old-fashioned view, I think, of popular entertainment, that it should just be pure entertainment. Um, but I think in terms of your first point, you know, a lot of people talk about media bias, but I think it's important to recognize that that bias doesn't come out of nowhere. That when we're talking about media representations, and this is one of the things I was trying to sort of get across in the paper, that those representations are very much interconnected with other things that are happening in society. So, I mean, the whole notion of alternative facts, I mean, that's not coming from the media, right? I mean, it says Kellyanne Conway who said that. And so, I mean, but you have these people who again are ensconced in the White House, who have this incredible amount of power, and in some ways the media are reliant on those people as sources, and so like if Steve Carr talks about alternative facts, no one gives like a rat's butt about that. But if you have one of the senior advisors in the Trump administration saying that, then the news media are going to report on that. So I mean, the argument I think that I'm trying to put forward here is that whether it's the news media, whether it's entertainment media, in either case, those depictions aren't kind of emerging in a thin air. That they are responding to, they are coming from things that are happening outside of the media itself. So,
Given those constraints on the media and the amount of bias that there is, do you have guidelines, some best practices to share with how people can more thoroughly and more objectively assess things, such as the consequences of bringing refugees in? For instance, you go to CNN and they put forward the stories of the suffering of the refugees. You go to Fox and you might find that there, but it'll be buried. It'll be down the fine print links. Or you may have to go to their menus to get to it. But they're going to put up front the stories about the riots in Sweden, or on New Year's Eve molestations and things like that. And that's what's going to be at the top. How does a person navigate all of that to figure out what really is going on, and then its impact on us and what we should do by virtue of American values, whatever?
well, I think the point that Noor made before is a good one. It's like, I mean, if you just take, for example, the Super Bowl ads, I think it's important to look at who's putting forward those ads. What do they stand to benefit besides kind of like the public goodwill and burnishing of their image? So I mean, I think there's that aspect. I also think a lot of times we maybe get trapped within like our own sort of American media ecosphere, and I think a lot of times it's helpful to kind of look at how other countries are covering it, even like English language coverage of us. I mean, even the BBC, for example, offers like a slightly different perspective. So I think getting a diversity of viewpoints, I think sort of examining maybe some of the underlying factors of where these voices are coming from and what their motivations might be. Other than that, I can tell you what I try to do as a film historian when I go back and look at this stuff is, I really try to use a variety of sources that go beyond just the film itself. So if I was going to think more about You, John Jones, I might want to look at like what the War Activities Committee was saying about the value of that film. The film was actually done for something called United Nations Week in 1943, so it might be interesting to go back and see if there are any press accounts of, during that time period that talked about like the audience response to that film. So, I mean, I think basically the short answer to your question would be, just trying to go through a variety of different sources. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any one-stop shopping solution to this stuff. And I recognize sometimes, you know, it's not convenient for most people to do that. Like, people often don't have that kind of time. But where possible, I think trying to gather many different perspectives would address some of what you're talking about. Yeah.
So, would you say that these films that showcase kind of sympathy also lead to like bigger problems that need addressed in America? Because I know right after this was like when the HUAC committee were going after like the Hollywood 10. Would you say that sympathy films get a lot of backlash?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, and just to kind of back up a little bit, I mean, I think we don't even necessarily need to look at the Hollywood 10 to consider some of the unintended consequences of a film like this. I mean, one of the criticisms of Hollywood depictions during this time was that it de-specified this sort of the particular hatred that was being directed against European Jews at the time. And so this kind of universalizing of suffering, I think the argument goes that it kind of trivialized and maybe, you know, blunted some of the potential criticism that could have been made, some of the potential awareness for American audiences of what was happening. So yeah, I mean, again, clearly the fact that you can kind of plop Margaret O'Brien into almost any situation and, like, you know, it's like, oh, okay, I'm supposed to sympathize with the Chinese, you know, war orphan is hugely problematic. I think that not so much in this film, but in some other films, particularly right after World War II, there was this move to try to demonize people who, many of whom consider themselves not so much pro-communist as much as anti-fascist. And that particularly targeted the creative community. And it went far beyond just the Hollywood 10. I mean, the Hollywood 10 were sort of the, you know, most celebrated cases, but there were in fact hundreds of people within the Hollywood community who, you know, ended up losing their jobs, their livelihood, who had to go overseas to get work, some of whom even committed suicide. And you know, I wouldn't say it was only because of their work doing these kinds of anti-Nazi projects, but it was, many times it was sort of guilt by association. The fact that they were strongly anti-Nazi, that they firmly believed that the work they were doing in film industry should reflect their political sensibilities, and they ended up experiencing serious consequences for that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So this film called You John
Jones.
Okay,
Yeah.
so You John Jones. So it's like the average American or man. So is there gender differences in like the refugee? So like sometimes like You John Jones, it's like protecting this is your daughter. So is there like similar cases for women? So it's more almost like gender differences in the refugee, or is it more just a general like we should take care of them because they're like our family kind of thing, humanitarian kind of thing?
That's a great question. I'm actually not aware of films that sort of focus specifically on sort of the female perspective on refugees. It's interesting, though, I think that so many of these films that do focus on the plight of refugees and war orphans and other sort of persecuted groups tend to focus on children. And often, at least in terms of fictionalized representations, those children are sort of set against some kind of older paternal figure. So I'm sure there are any number of exceptions. One film that I've done some work on from 1948 called The Search has a UN worker who's female, and she's featured prominently in the film. Although the sort of the central character, central relationship in the film is male-male, an American soldier who kind of adopts a Czech war orphan. but yeah, I think most of the time, most of these films, the primary figure tends to be like, or so the primary adult figure tends to be a male person. I do think it's worth kind of mentioning or worth talking a little bit about the idea of sort of why children. Why are children so important in this equation? Especially if you're trying to sort of garner sympathy for refugees in his films. And I, again, I think I mentioned the 3-year-old Syrian boy, Aylan Kurdi, that kind of became such a watershed moment in the sort of debate over Syrian refugees. So it's interesting to me that it sort of takes an image of a child to actually garner sympathy. Yeah, Rick.
I was just going to say that's probably because they're perceived innocents. They don't have a role in the political decisions and the war or conflicts that might be going on, causing refugee crises, right? That's probably why there's that appeal.
Yeah. So they're sort of like the tabula rasa. You can kind of put whatever you want on them because they're like little innocents.
Yeah, just to reinforce that, I do a lot of work with political speeches and everything of leaders around the world and non-state leaders as well, terrorist leaders and whatnot. And children as innocence is a vehicle that's very often used. It comes up repeatedly. We're always coding that. Yeah, for that reason, yeah. And actually, reflecting on that, during the campaign at one point when Trump was talking about the Syrian refugees, I recall him saying all he saw were, strong young men, right? Trying to de-emphasize those that would be perceived as innocents.
Right. And sort of shift the sympathies away. Again, based on gender in this case. When in fact, I believe, again, there are probably people in here who are much more knowledgeable about this than I am, but the majority of refugees coming from Syria actually are women and children. In fact, probably the majority of refugees, period, are women and children.
Yeah, and I was going to say not just gender in that case, it's also kind of an age class or age category that is being emphasized and de-emphasizing younger children as well as women and old people, right? And my understanding is, yes, it wasn't only primarily women and children, but also elderly males, in terms of Syrian refugees.
The Greek refugees in that film, I don't think there was a single, healthy young male in the group.
Right. And again, I think it's interesting to me that the visual politics of these representations kind of play out the sort of politics of this. So when I hear comments like that, I think really not much has changed in our discourse about this situation. That we're still seeing like a little like wounded child is going to garner more sympathy for audiences than, for example, seeing like a 20-something male or female even for that matter. Yeah.
Two questions, both referring to FDR's universal suffrage. So first, was that kind of a way for him to kind of get around like the very strong anti-Semitism that was happening in the United States? Two, would there be a danger of the idea of like everyone suffering, even though like some people suffer, like some refugee populations suffer more than others?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of the strategy of the Roosevelt administration, that this was this was clearly a tactic that they used to basically try to bolster public support. So, if you think about things like the Nuremberg laws, which came into being in 1935, if you think about Kristallnacht, which occurred in November of 1938, those are very well publicized events, and so the world knew about how the Nazis were targeting the Jews at that time, but I think most of the press coverage was sympathetic to European and particularly German Jews, but when when it came time to sort of to performing action, I think the Roosevelt administration, very quickly figured out that by singling out Jews as being the subjects of Nazi persecution, they were not going to get very far in terms of gathering support. It's not to say that, again, this is, I think, Breitman and Lichtman's book are useful in kind of explaining that there was a lot behind the scenes that the Roosevelt administration was trying to do, and they weren't perfect, and it took Roosevelt a long time to kind of, realize that he had to perform some kind of action. But in terms of some of the public attitudes that were being expressed by people like Hedda Hopper, I think that was a fairly typical, that if it came down to letting, Jewish refugees into this country and giving them work, that we really needed to take care of our own. So in terms of the consequences, we know what happened as a result of not intervening sooner. I mean because the primary emphasis was on winning the war and not on rescue, that there was like millions of people who basically perished during that time. And again, it's not to say that Roosevelt and Breitman and Lichtman's was a hero or a villain. It's just to say that whatever his administration did was constrained by the kind of political and social context of the time.
Has there been very much written about Congress at that time and kind of the debates going on there? Because, of course, in the case of any president, they're somewhat constrained by the purse strings held by Congress. And my understanding is that Roosevelt was, as you were suggesting, was written about in the book, trying behind the scenes to do things, recognize that there were issues going on, but whatever motives was constrained, as you say, to do things. And I was just curious to know to what degree perhaps debates and discourse going on in Congress might have been constraining.
Yeah, well, there's been actually quite a bit of scholarship, and Breitman and Lichtman's book goes into some detail about how the Roosevelt administration was trying to negotiate with Congress. I've actually myself written about how the Senate went after Hollywood, based on this issue. I mean, there was a fear at that time that so-called Jewish control over Hollywood was in fact pushing the U.S. into war. So it's a sort of isolationist framework. And so the Senate committee hauled a bunch of film industry personnel and executives to testify before Senate, sort of like a prelude to the HUAC hearings, and to kind of question them on whether or not they were too sympathetic to European Jews at the time. So I mean, there was like that aspect. Breitman and Lichtman's book also talk a lot about the role of the State Department during this time. And in fact, there were a number of officials in the State Department who were actively blocking greater immigration of Jews from Europe during this time. And their book does a good job of kind of going through people's diaries and finding like awful things that are, memos and stuff that were being sent, and finding these awful statements that are being made about European Jews amongst State Department personnel. And this is a division that's like responsible for, for issuing visas and whatnot. So, again, I think, Breitman and Lichtman's book is probably a good source to cover, most of, what was happening at both Congress and the State Department level. So.
Related to that, what can you tell us about how explicitly Lindbergh's America First movement was involved in these, opposition to not just refugees, but the movie industry too?
Yeah. Was that what you were going to ask as well?
Sort of similar, but no.
So and I'll just try to answer this quickly. So Lindbergh was part of this America First movement. So, I guess not surprisingly, we now are hearing America First being invoked once again. Unfortunately, people who invoke it now seem to forget what America First was associated with back in the 1940s. And Lindbergh kind of gave an infamous speech in September of 1941 in Des Moines, Iowa, where he said the biggest threat to this nation were three groups: the Roosevelt administration, the British, who the argument was that Britain was trying to drag the United States into this war where the United States really had very little interest, and the third group was the Jews. And Lindbergh argued that the Jews were a threat to this country because of their widespread control of the media, and that is a common argument that gets made throughout history. And again, that's one of those arguments that I think needs to be confronted for what it is, which is anti-Semitic. In fact, there are even people in the Trump administration now who are associated with the Trump administration who are saying very similar things. And so I think we'd be wise to go back and look at the history of that period and look at figures like Lindbergh and understand what it was that they stood for. Those attitudes, they don't just disappear, they go someplace, and even if they go underground, more than likely they are going to reappear at some point, and that's why they need to be confronted. So yeah.
So that was sort of related to my question. A lot of the undercurrent of what we've been talking about seems to be related to fear of the other, and a lot of the anti-immigrant sort of dialogue that's going on right now talks a lot about, like you just said, America First, which is why I was nodding my head, and then we're a Christian country, and if you move to this country, you should speak English. And a lot of the immigrants in around the World War II period obviously were Jewish immigrants, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism, but now the thing that's glaringly obvious in the media, it's the so-called Muslim ban, and they're seen as other as well. So a lot of the rhetoric that you talked about, putting us first, not taking jobs away from other people, would you think that would still be used and be true, so to speak, if the refugees we were talking about were white Christian type people? Do you think they would still try to use that same argument, and or is it really that otherness that allows them to be successful at doing that in their portrayal and such?
I mean, it's a good question, and I'd be curious to hear from other folks what you think about that in response to your question. I think my answer would be it depends. It depends on sort of what ways in which the people are othered. What's interesting to me is that the ways in which Muslims are being demonized right now is very similar to the ways in which Jews were being demonized in the 1930s and 1940s. And by the way, Jews obviously aren't Christian, but Jews are sort of white. Jews kind of fit a lot of the sort of things that mainstream society finds desirable, and yet Jews were still kind of demonized as being a threat during this period. So I think it kind of depends on maybe what some of the corporate interests might be. It depends on what the political interests happen to be at the time. If it's convenient, if say for example we're talking about an enemy, an out-and-out enemy of the country, and it's convenient for the United States to say admit refugees from that enemy nation, then I think there's less likelihood of demonization. Certainly the sort of the sort of identity politics are not irrelevant to this. There's always going to be some stigma against admitting refugees from Somalia, for example, because they're not white. But I think the problem with this kind of racist and xenophobic these racist and xenophobic attitudes is they're so indiscriminate in terms of who they heap insult upon injury. So yeah, Andrew, you're going to say something.
Well, just kind of going off that, I can't help but wonder if it ever could be the same, considering that white Christian has been the majority for so long. I can't help but wonder if it ever could be demonized in the same way that Muslims are now.
I was going to say Catholics were not perceived of as being Christian, they're papists, and you just need to look back to the Irish immigrations and subsequently Italians, and how just yesterday in my bioanthropology I was showing an image from the late 1800s where Irish were being categorized as black and related to Africans. But the other thing I was going to say that's somewhat similar between what was going on in terms of demonization of Jews as well as now of Muslims, there's kind of this undercurrent of somewhat dehumanizing or making them other in ways that, you know, they carry vermin and diseases and they have these kinds of predilections, and it's kind of this notion that biologically they are distinct and that they can't help that being distinct and being this particular way. And the same is also true of Muslims. They're not capable of having democracy. They're not capable of, you know, integrating into U.S. society because it's foreign to their way, as if it's something that's ingrained in their genetics. And I think this is a very similar kind of narrative that goes on. It is a dehumanizing narrative. It's demonization through dehumanization.
Because if you humanize the people, then you would have to like do something. You'd have to like admit them to the country. You'd have to find another home for them.
Yeah, and I guess kind of to maybe reflect on that also a little bit. I don't know a lot about the history of anti-Semitism, but it does seem to be there was a real undercurrent of racial thinking. It's this race, and this race has these problems, and maybe some history thrown in about Jews' role in certain parts of society, like money, banking, or the film industry. There were those kinds of stereotypes thrown in, but tied into a racial argument.
Right.
With Islam, I mean, Islam is so diverse, you can't make the racial argument. But what they make, I think, is this ideological argument that there's something about the ideology of Islam, and you know, and if we reduce that, that's talking about the Islamic scriptures. So I'm wondering if in the history of anti-Semitism, you know, if we look at those kinds of the ways people talk and dehumanize, is there any similar kind of questioning of the ideology of Judaism itself, the Hebrew texts, and you know, some of those, or is that kind of absent from those?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there's, I think there is. I wouldn't say this is pronounced, but I think there is a distinction between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So the Old Testament is seen as kind of like the harsher, you know, knife, the sort of eye for an eye type thing, which, you know, then gets smoothed over, with like the teachings of Jesus. But I also think your point about the kind of the sort of lack of a racial component with regards to Islamophobia. I think there's an undercurrent still of kind of racialized thinking. But what I find really interesting is this argument that there's almost genetics of terrorism involved in Islam, that Islam is kind of inherently prone to terrorism, which seems to really parallel a lot of the historical anti-Semitism that was racialized in many cases, and argued, for example, that Jews were inherently good in dealing with money, or that Jews were inherently prone to, you know, to be like anarchists, sort of like violent politics. You know, it's sort of interesting the way in which this sort of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism line up in many ways, but then there are some kind of distinct permutations. And that makes me wonder if racism itself can sort of easily be like sort of substituted for things like, you know, fear of terrorism, that's now the sort of new racism, or that's the new ways in which we sort of perpetuate racism, but we call it terrorism. Thank you all very much. I really enjoyed it.